Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and today I'm actually looking at the 1858 match between Paul Morphy and Adolf Anderssen. I've chosen 4 games from the match, and there were actually a few games that were played after the match that we have. And Morphy pretty much took Adolf to school, especially after the match. After the match, it was 4-1. No, there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where Morphy had white pieces twice, and Anderssen had the black pieces. And Adolf Anderssen had the white pieces 3 times. So Morphy had 2 whites to 3 blacks after the official match, which, if I remember correctly, was a first to 6. First to 6 wins, draws not counting. And Anderssen won 1 game. 2 games. Yeah, Anderssen won 2 games, and Morphy won 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, it was a first to 7 wins. There were 2 draws in the match. Now, I'm going to show you one of the games that was played after the match as well, but we're going to start with game 1, which had Morphy as white, Anderssen as black, and it was an Evans Gambit. And this is all theory. Even nowadays, this is still theory. I think the first move that I don't think a modern player would play is Bishop C6. I think Queen A4 is maybe slightly more accurate. There are a handful of ways to play the Evans. In the modern era, E5 is still correct. There's a lot of different ways to play this, right? Anyway, pawn takes, Queen A4. This is all pretty reasonable from both colors as well. Bishop B2 is actually a mistake. And the reason is the bishop actually needs to be over closer to the king. And on B2, it's just not doing much. As I like to say, it's biting on granite, except it's its own granite. And without a light squared bishop, white really needs to focus on making that dark squared bishop as good as possible. And it's just not good on B2. So that's why E3 is probably the correct move. And just a sample variation goes something along these lines. And the game is roughly balanced. Instead, Bishop E2 was chosen, and like I said, that was a pretty bad mistake from Paul Morphy. It was kind of a strategic blunder. Now, we definitely don't see Evans Gambits a lot these days at the top level, but it does get played. I think there was a game in Tata Steel, not the top section, but the second section. There was an Evans Gambit in that section, I believe. Bishop to F3. So, and Anderssen, by the way, is playing this game very accurately. Rook E8 is just nice. Though Knight H3 might have been playable at this point, and with a similar position to the game position. And Morphy takes a pawn, but it's not to take a pawn. It's actually to try to bring his queen over to the defense of the king because the pawn was interfering. Computer actually prefers white going here in order to try and defend, but still likes black. And yeah, I mean, it looks pretty bad for white, and it probably is. But it's kind of weird. Morphy's trying, and he's defending really well. Now, here, Morphy made a slight error in that he played queen c6. Weirdly, or not weirdly, but it's kind of strange because he is down material, but he's being attacked. So for him, he really just needs to trade queens and buckle up and enter this exchange up ending where he's defending. And that would have been a better way to play and would have given him some drawing chances. Instead, Morphy played in the style of the time, which is don't trade queens, try to attack. And queen d7, and Morphy tried to repeat, always repeat. Rook e6 would have been another way for Anderssen to try to find an advantage. And just blow up the center that way, because checkmate probably isn't going to happen. But Morphy tried to repeat. Anderssen was not obliging. And strangely, I would have wanted to play knight takes g5, but queen takes, rook takes, and pawn takes, and rook takes, and it's a rook ending where black has 2 extra pawns, and they're on both sides of the board. Black's rooks are better. Black's king is safer. Black's better in that ending. But Morphy gets active and tries to play very energetically. And actually, rook ed8 is a slight error, and I'm shocked Morphy didn't attempt this. Because what happens is white wins a pawn back, and yeah, okay, he's not great in this ending, but it's maybe, you can maybe hold this ending. Instead, he played queen f6, which is understandable. You're going straight for mate, and there's some ideas that you can try to play. Queen b7 was an interesting idea, but I like tripling. I think that's better. d1, d1, and queen f1 was another idea, just to make, it makes rook d3 better. And I'm going to give both players credit. They played this ending reasonably well, all things considered. And Morphy made a very tough attempt, but you just couldn't actually win this game. You can't win if there's no pawns, and Morphy is trying to draw. And Morphy plays pretty good technique, except he kind of loses track of where to check. If his queen was a little bit more out in the open and Black's king couldn't get behind the pawns, Morphy may have had a chance of drawing that one. But that didn't happen. Instead, we go to game 2. Now, the opening they play in this match, the Spanish, and particularly the variation that they played, it's not really theory nowadays, but they played it twice in this match, showing that both players actually respect it. And it's not even a bad way to play. I think d5 is okay. You know, if the king was castled, it would be very reminiscent of a marshal. So that should tell you the idea is roughly good. It's just the kings aren't castled yet, and both sides castle. h6, d4 is good move. And you get to see how players from the 1850s handled a isolated queen pawn position. And actually, I think this exact position, no, okay. It's a little bit too deep in the game, but a very similar position occurs in game 4 of the match, which we're not going to be reviewing. Morphy won that one pretty easily, but it also just was not really... It's not a game that I would want to show. It's a good game and you should look at it, but a lot of the themes that we're going to cover are talked about here, except for the tactics, right? c4, and actually knight f5 is a mistake. Instead, Anderssen should have played rook e1 with this sort of a position. And materials equal... black has an extra pawn. Black's a little bit better, but it's not like crushing. Instead, after knight f5, black gets a pretty crushing advantage. Because Anderssen went all in on an attack that he really wasn't set up to make because black's king was just too safe. Knight d5 would have been another take on the position, but Morphy played queen d7, which is perfectly reasonable. After bishop h6, which is just tactically it's bad, but it's a logical idea. Gh6, queen h6, bishop d4, great move, brings defense to the king side once the knight moves. Queen h6, rook e1 check, great move so far. Now, I like what the engine says black can do, and black is completely winning in that variation. I'll show it. Instead, queen takes f5 can be played, and this would have been the icing on the cake for Morphy, because he's got 2 rooks and a knight for the queen, and I don't see how Anderssen holds the draw in this position. Because, yeah, okay, you're going to give up a little bit because the queen takes king e8, so queen takes c7, king e8, and black's just doing well. And we can make arguments that bishop f2, knight somewhere is going to be pretty effective at some point. And the king is actually pretty safe. So that's an interesting variation. Instead, Morphy chose knight e4, which is kind of logical. He's being attacked, so he wants to defend. But this actually throws away his advantage. And we see a similar idea. And this is actually good awareness by Morphy not to take that. Though he can probably take it with the queen. Because that defends. Why can't he just take the knight? Now I want to know. Okay, Morphy can absolutely take the knight and have a roughly even position. But queen d6 is also roughly even. So, okay, so my gut instinct of why couldn't he take the knight? But, this is all roughly even. It is a little bit weird that taking the knight is only roughly even. That implies that black's going to lose one of his extra rooks, because that's the only way that position is even. And I don't know how that position is even. And they got this ending, which is pretty even. And they just agreed to a draw here. Now, moving on, Lowenthal analyzed some of these games and actually annotated some of these games. And we're going to look at his analysis and see if it's correct. And fun fact, his notes are suspicious. They are very suspicious. And I'm not sure Lowenthal was the player to be annotating these games, because whenever he played Anderssen, he got crushed. When he played Morphy in 1850, before the tournament Anderssen won to be world champion, Morphy crushed Lowenthal. So, yeah. And of course, an engine really doesn't like it. And I double-checked all my analysis with an engine for once. Though my belief, and I may talk about this, is that engines are okay if you use them correctly, but just blindly trusting an engine eval is not a way to develop your chess skill. Anyway, so Morphy played e4, e5, knight c6, and we get a Spanish. And knight f6, this could lead to a Berlin. For example, if Morphy played here, 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 here. This is the famous Berlin ending. Now, it's famous for a very hilarious reason. And these days, if a grandmaster were to wind up, or back then in that era, if you had this variation, they would actually play this and this. And this was considered a better way back then for black to play. Now, we know this is a somewhat suspicious position, because but on the other hand, it leaves a little bit more of a dynamic game because the queen can get out. But d4 was Morphy's choice, and you get something similar to a bird Spanish, which is there, right? And the correct move is to take that there and play here. Basically, invite him to take and strengthen your center, a la the Evans Gambit. They're probably not going to do that, but, I believe this is White's idea. So anyway, back to the main game. Whoop. Knight d4, knight d4, e d4, and this was considered okay at the time. e5 is a good move, and c6 was played. Now, Lowenthal, being Lowenthal, says c6 is, quote, a weak move and the cause of all subsequent embarrassment. Which is funny because this is actually one of the better moves according to the engine. And, okay, it's logical you're talking about equal danger here because pawn takes bishop, or pawn takes knight, pawn takes bishop, something like that. I personally would prefer to play knight d5 in this situation. I don't necessarily disagree with the engine saying that c6 is a really good move. I just prefer knight d5 because it makes a little bit more sense to me. c6 is a good move, though. Lowenthal is just wrong here, and if you don't move the bishop, which, by the way, moving the bishop is not a good move. So instead, and the reason why it's not a good move is if he takes it, he just destroys his pawn structure and you take the knight back. So doesn't really matter. Now, Morphy castled. An alternative is actually queen d4, leading to knight d5 and bishop c4, and white has a slight edge. But castles is fine. Now, black had a few ways he could play. Anderssen actually chose to take that bishop, which I somewhat disagree with, but I kind of understand the motivation. Knight d5, queen d4, and position's roughly even, as weird as it is. It said c takes b5, bishop g5. To quote Lowenthal, much stronger than taking the knight at once. He's correct here. I'll give him credit there. Bishop e7, the only correct reply. If h6, white can play either rook e1 or ef6, in each case, a win with ease. Yeah, he's right, but h6 is a complete blunder. Like, it's really bad. And I get the idea behind h6. You want to kick that bishop so you can move the knight. Or at least if pawn takes knight, take the bishop. Okay, it's not so good because other factors, That's all you have to consider to reject h6. You don't have to look for the best move. You just have to be able to correctly reject pawn takes knight, pawn takes bishop, because pawn takes bishop. So, yeah, no. Lowenthal, h6 is a nothing move. It's showing what the threat is, effectively. But no, ef6, bishop takes h6, or f6, and gf6 would have been equally bad. For white's reply would have been queen d4 with one game. Let's see, Lowenthal, is that correct? d5 is okay, it's not the greatest, and this position is, white has an edge, but it's not lost. Instead, the engine actually suggests queen to b6, and it says the game is basically even. Though white it doesn't say it's even, but white doesn't have a massive advantage. White's better for sure. But most of that's due to the pawn structure. Materials equal. Actually, black has an extra pawn, but black's development is garbage. Black's pawn structure is garbage. So white's better. So, no, gf6 wouldn't have been bad or losing. Bishop f6 is also hilariously not completely losing. King f8, bishop f6, queen f6, c3. White's better in this position, absolutely. I'm not going to disagree with c3, though the engine does prefer knight d2 or queen d2. For queen d2 is much preferred, though I don't 100% understand why. I actually like c3. It makes sense to me. d5 was played by Anderssen, though engine prefers b6, and it says black is not dead lost. Basically, it says white has an edge. d5, cd4 is absolutely correct, and then white plays pretty well for most of this. Queen b3 is pretty good. Rook a to e1, quote, vigorously and ably followed up. I'm not quite so sure what Lowenthal was getting at with that one. And Anderssen played g5, quote, apprehensive of the advance of the f-pawn. Engine likes g6, and weirdly, the best idea for white is what a modern player would play, which is a4. Knight e2 is probably what Morphy would have played, and yeah, I understand why. g5 is just, I'm not entirely sure what the point of g5 is. Queen d1, bringing the queen over to the king side, because Morphy senses black's king is weak. You could have made an argument for knight e2 or even a4 as white here in this position as well. Though h4 is also another idea. Queen f6, rook 1 to e3, which is, it has a very subtle threat, which is simply taking the bishop. And Anderssen made a blunder, and it's a blunder that most modern grandmasters would not make. Heck, most modern intermediate players would not make this blunder. They'd play something like king g8 and avoid it, because you're just losing a piece with the move Anderssen played, which is rook g8. And I get why he played it, but it's just not a good move. Instead, king g7 is actually best, followed by h4, h6, and rook f3, and white's better to winning. But rook g8 was played, and Morphy ended with rook takes e6, and there's no defense. If he takes with the pawn, rook f3 wins the queen, and you got a queen and knight versus two rooks, queen and knight, and black's in check with a loose king. White's winning that. And it's the same situation the other way if he takes with the queen. Rook e6, pawn e6, queen f3. And again, white's just better. Actually, I will go ahead and save it because there's some interesting opening analysis. We're going to skip the next few games and go to not the final game, and not even the final game Morphy won. Obviously, Morphy won the final game of the match, but this is probably one of the best games of the match, one of the most entertaining games of the match at the very least. And again, look at this. We've got notes by Lowenthal. How good are they? And by the way, this was a Sicilian, and this is a pretty modern take on the Sicilian. To quote Lowenthal, this is better than a6, but even now the king bishop is shut in, and the queen pawn is rendered weak. Yeah, he's correct. And it's a position. Now, a more modern player might play knight 1c3 and get this position, which is kind of weird because white's basically lost a tempo. White's basically lost 2 tempi. 2 tempi in one of these Scheveningen Najdorf type Sicilians, or even a Richter-Rauser type Sicilian, yet Engine says slight advantage white. And that's really just because of, you can make an argument that's because of the move order. Because black allowed this weakness there. Now, Morphy actually played bishop to f4, which is kind of old hat. It's not bad. It's just maybe not optimal. Because now after e5, bishop e3, black has other alternatives. And actually, hilariously, if you let the engine sit a little bit, it doesn't even hate what Anderssen played. A6 is probably the best move, and to quote Lowenthal, by the way, on bishop f4, Lowenthal said it was correctly played, compelling the advance of the e-pawn, which leaves the queen's pawn weak and unsupported. Yeah, okay, he's talking about the famous backward hanging pawn structure, as well as that big old hole on d5, though I wish he would have talked about that. On f5, Lowenthal says a6 would have been sounder play, but even then the game would have been in favor of the first player. Well, let's see if he's correct. Wait a second. This is very similar to a Sveshnikov. It's a little weird. How about knight f6, which is personally what, I think some people would play. And knight c3 is what you could play, though I did want to look at bishop c4 just to show you that that pawn can't be taken if you don't defend it. Specifically, if you play bishop c4, you can't take that pawn because queen d5 just wrecks your position. But f5 isn't hated by the engine, and it's kind of actually a logical follow-up in the Sicilian. And, it's one of the key breaks in a lot of these open Sicilians, and I don't have a problem with it, unlike Lowenthal. Though I do sort of agree that a6 may have been a little bit better, just hitting a piece. Morphy does nothing about that pawn. He says, okay, push f4. I'm going to have a very good position. And f4. Lowenthal says, it's a fine conception. And Lowenthal says, had black played a6, white's reply still would have been knight d5 with a winning game. Is it? Is it winning? Oops. Come on, chess base. There we go. a6. Knight d5. A takes b5. Bishop b6. Queen h4. Knight to c7. King f7. And white takes. And actually, this variation is very much winning for white, as is the other variation, which I think Morphy would have played rather than going for the rook and putting his knight in the corner and allowing that check. Instead, I have a feeling Morphy would have played queen d5, and you can't play bishop e6, so king g6. Because I believe it's king to e7, and I'd castle. And I think black is just crushing here. But king g6 is preferred. g3, queen e4, f e4, knight a8. And yeah, okay, white's better here. So yeah, no, Lowenthal's absolutely correct in this case. f4 is challenging. Knight d5, f e3. And so far, actually, by the way, the engine doesn't hate what black's doing. Knight b to c7 was played. Though I found another interesting line, hilariously, and we'll look at that. Queen f3 is possible, allowing queen a5, c3, knight f6, b4, queen a4, knight takes check, g takes, queen takes, ef2, king f2, queen c2, king e3, a6, bishop d3, queen g2, knight c7. And I thought well, basically, white's better here, but it's really messy. And on bishop h6, again, white's better here, but it's complicated. It's messy. You know, you're up in exchange with an extra pawn. It's really messy. So Morphy actually found a simpler and easier way to convert the position. With knight b to c7 check. King f7, queen f3 check. Best move, though engine says you can play knight takes a8. Knight f6, bishop c4. Lowenthal says the attack is now irresistible. Is it? Knight d4, best move. Knight f6, best move. d5. And by the way, Lowenthal says if the bishop had been interposed, white would have taken it checking. And on knight retaking, would have played knight d5, discovered check, and a winning game without difficulty. Okay? Obviously, once my computer shows the position. And yes, this is just crushing. White has an extra piece, and black's king is terrible. d5 was correct. Bishop takes d5 was correct. King g6. Weirdly. Okay, so king g6 is actually losing, and it might very well be the losing move. I understand why it was played. So, we're going to look at queen d5 first, which says on king g6, to quote Lowenthal, had the queen captured the bishop, white would have taken with the knight, discovering check, and have remained eventually with a pawn ahead and a winning position. Well, let's see. And now that everything is kind of cleared up, yeah, white has an extra pawn. Black does have the two bishops as compensation, but I much prefer white. Those knights are great. Those knights are beautiful. And it's actually going to be a little difficult for black to prove how to defend this ending. Like, it's actually difficult. Instead, found this response which the engine likes. At first, the engine's like, this is terrible. However, when you go down the line, eventually, and you'd probably have to let an engine sit for an hour to figure out that this is a draw, when you could just play the best move for both sides, and then about 3 moves later, it'll show dead draw, and then you go back, and it remembers its previous calculations. Also, hilariously, this was a Lowenthal Sicilian. Queen h5, takes the knight, check, take the rook, and basically this is the continuation. And it goes on, but engine says this is dead drawn. In the 1800s, I'm not so sure about that. On the other hand, what I am sure about is that it's really actually hard for white to make progress on the black king. It's also hard for black to do anything. And black's pieces are slightly better. He also has an extra exchange, though I think it's going to be 2 pieces for the rook. It's really messy. So king e7 would have been a better defense. Queen h5 check, king takes f6. You take there, and to quote Lowenthal, knight e8 check, seemingly a good move, is only an appearance, as black might have taken it when placed there, and on white taking the queen would have answered with bishop b4 check, obtaining a winning game. Now, is it winning? Well, let's put it on the board. Knight to e... Oops, sorry. I'm going to delete that variation, which I didn't mean to put in there. Knight to e8, queen takes the knight, there, and I guess, oh wait, God, I guess king f1 has to be played. Take that. What is it? Yeah, no. Bishop and knight versus, yeah. That's just 2 extra pieces. Yeah, that's completely winning. Obviously, Morphy wasn't going to play that. He instead played f takes e3, knight takes c2, king e2, and Anderssen resigned here because white is not quite mating, but the position is really bad. So we're going to move on to the final game that I'm going to show you. And it was played after the match was over. It was the first game played after the match was over. By the way, I think one of these was two of the match games were played on Christmas, by the way. So, what do we have here? We have a King's Gambit. And believe it or not, the engine actually likes this. At least the engine I use to analyze this likes this variation for black. Now, engine for some reason says white should play h3, but you're a King's Gambiter. You're not going to play h3. There's a lot of moves in this position. Bishop c4 is suboptimal in my opinion, though every now and then I'll play it. Knight c3 is not terrible. H4 is the game continuation, and I actually like d4, and I gave a sample variation. And you're going to laugh, but top engine move, 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 best engine, top engine move. And it says, by the way, white may be slightly better if queen takes queen. It says maybe black has a half pawn advantage with this. Top engine move, top engine move, top engine move, and theory says this, and white has compensation for the rook. Is it enough? Well, black has a very difficult time defending these positions, so we'll see. H4, G4, knight E5, Knight f6. And again, here's a choice. By the way, this is still book. Knight g4 was played in game, which that's not a terrible move. d4 is very much theory, and I believe it was either d4 or knight c3 that was played in Spassky Fischer in 1962 or 63. I don't remember which one. But it prompted Fischer to try to refute the King's Gambit, which came up with a move 3.d6, and after d4, g5, I'm not sure the insertion of d6, d4 has actually really helped black. I mean, it helped his development and has made the position a little bit better from that perspective, but you've got g3, g4, knight to h4, and there's a lot of choices, but white does okay in those positions, and that's what a modern theoretical take on the position would be. Engine actually really likes this with this type of a continuation, and it's messy. So King's Gambiters will like that. Knight takes g4 was played in game though, followed by knight e4. Though d6 is also another move. And it leads to this sort of a position. Queen e2 is probably better. But d3 isn't terrible. g3, bishop takes pawn, and Engine likes queen e7. It would have said that black has a slight edge, maybe even a better position with something like this. Though white still has compensation for the pawn. Again, it says black is better though. Knight takes h1. I somewhat agree, somewhat disagree. I'd say it's an unclear position, though it's messy. Knight h1 was played, and Engine also doesn't 100% hate this. Says that black is at least equal. And from a material standpoint, I would agree. However, from the perspective of the position, bro, your pieces, buddy, your pieces are terrible. And to give it a good example, white decides to sacrifice a lot of material in order to get black's queen. So we've got a piece and a rook versus a queen. Versus a queen and a pawn. Sorry. 2 pieces and a rook versus a queen and a pawn. You'd think that would favor the pieces and the rook. However, these pieces are at home. This rook's at home. This knight's in the corner. White defends the pawn. Gets attacked. Doesn't really matter. The knight's trapped and a pawn is attacked. Rook g8, just letting the pawn hang. Morphy decides to take him. By the way, this is not a being greedy or a mistake. Check. King goes to d2. That's fine. It allows the rook to get active when needed. Rook to e8, looking to play bishop to e1. Knight to a3. Knight a6 was played, which is a blunder. Instead, black should have gotten his knight out, and he's actually slightly worse. Because of a continuation, something like that. Instead, knight a6, developing a piece, was a blunder. And the reason why is it allows queen h5, hitting the bishop. Bishop retreats. Queen h1, winning the knight. So now it's just a bishop and a rook for the queen, and white still has that extra pawn. Black takes the extra pawn. Check. King d7. It's very important that the king goes to d7. However, alternatives like rook e7 don't really help the black position because of something akin to probably knight b5. But then again, it might just very well be the case that rook b1 is what gets played, bishop takes, and then you hit the bishop, and position is still bad. King d7 was played, trying to avoid king c7 leading to knight b5, and now white keeps material on the board and saves both his knight and his rook. King d7, rook b1, take the knight, and queen a4 check, and Anderssen resigned here. Showcasing that when you have no development, it doesn't really matter that you're moving your queen around like a lunatic. Sometimes it's the best plan. Anyway, that's going to do it for that match. I hope you all enjoyed. I'll see you all next time. Take it easy. Bye-bye.